Hello, today I want to move on to looking at how to combine punches with kicks. And the first important thing to say about that is that you don't need too much coach intervention on that. A lot of it, you can just see how it's done and then you practice with drills and you build up organically like that. So obviously, as I always say, it's always better if there is someone there who can check your posture and correct you on the spot. But so much good work can be done just through practicing drills, thinking about the posture, thinking about how it's constructed, and building drills yourself and just working through and letting your body in many ways teach you. That's the proceed via intuition method of Yiquan. Okay, so let's begin. We've got quite a lot of things that we've already looked at that interconnect now, that have a lot of structural sympathy with combining punches and kicks, and that's a really key important idea. We start seeing how the overall structural integration of the paradigm works now. And remember, this is very much the idea that the intent doesn't just know the movements. It's not like you can just do standing. Those people who say you can just do standing and you don't really need techniques and you don't really need to practice techniques, I don't know where that comes from, but I know where it ends up, which is nowhere. So you need to practice techniques and you need to give the intent this ability to fluidly move with techniques and with the technical paradigm. And the more our physical structure and our physical movement is trained within that paradigm, the more our intent is able to do that. And the trick is, of course, like in most cases, in most kinds of martial arts, particularly in Chinese martial arts, it's the same idea, but you become trapped within like a very limited movement paradigm. It's a very limited set of movements. Whereas the idea in each one is to turn that inside out so that we become liberated, having our physical movement interlinked with this continuously expanding concept, physical movement, structural movement concept that just continuously expands, and it's got infinite possibilities. And that's the way it's designed. So it's a really sophisticated idea that you've got to get your mind around. It's not like, here's like 10 specific forms, and those 10 specific forms are the movement paradigm of a particular branch of wushu. You know, like there's X amount of forms in Hungar, for example, and you learn those, and that's your movement paradigm. This turns that inside out and says, yeah, well, we learn, instead of forms, we replace that with the idea of form, like configuration. So I've said before, Wang Xiangjia uses this idea of Taolu, which we normally mean forms when we say Taolu, and he changes it around to mean configuration, individual configurations. And we turn the whole thing around so that we liberate our movement into this vast paradigm of structural movement that's based on principles, not fixed techniques. And I've said before, that can be quite a difficult thing to get your head around. And one of the ways that functions is that all the different elements of it are interconnected into their overall structural interconnectivity of the paradigm. And one of the concepts, or two of the important concepts that we use to explain how that functions, are sympathy, structural sympathy, and manufacturing sympathy. And to recap, by sympathy we mean that a particular movement favours another particular kind of movement. Or if you're in one, even if you're in one movement, that the way that the movement is structured is all designed to be sympathetic to the generation of power, but within the overall context of the reality of the fight. And we've talked many times about how there might be another technique that's more powerful, but it's the wrong thing to do in an actual fight because it's more dangerous, or there's some other aspects of it that isn't conducive, but it leaves you open, or that's dangerous, or so on, or that it doesn't have sympathy with the next movement so that it inhibits our ability to flow into combinations, for example. We talked about how that's quite a big problem in Xing Yiquan, for example. So even within a single movement, we can find that the structural movement paradigm is designed to create sympathy with the movement. So things like using the pivot route to get power into a hook or something like that. And you know, we've also talked about, I see all these kind of pointless discussions. Well, not pointless because it's kind of thrashing it out, but like in many ways coming to pointless conclusions about should you use pivot routing, shouldn't you use pivot routing and things like that. And I think we've seen so far in this series that actually within this kind of next gen Yiquan, we have a significantly more sophisticated understanding of that stuff, that sometimes we use pivot routing and sometimes we don't, and we have rules around that. For example, when we lean over the foot, we don't use pivot routing, and that explains things like what do we do if we want to lean over and cover and then change into a punch, that if we're going to stay close we don't use a pivot route and so on. So we know that the paradigm is sophisticated like that, and the only way that we can really learn that is by practicing drills, and it's the same thing with the postures that I'm going to look at today. And another way that sympathy works is that if we do one movement like this, for example, up on the pivot route, that it flows naturally into another movement. So it flows naturally, for example, into a cross. We can go 1, 2 and use the transmission of the body's actual physical weight, 1, and add into the rotational Farley, and that helps to generate force. And that gives us the idea that some movements are more sympathetic than others. So for example, if I want to go from here, if I want to do a lead hand uppercut, that's not so sympathetic as that. It's not as sympathetic as a backhand uppercut, for example. There's less structural sympathy for it. Then we use different techniques to then manufacture sympathy. So for example, we drop the foot down into what we call the quarter routing, and then we drop the hand, 1, 2, and we use the short power movement of the shoulder to create more movement in the posture. 1, 2, like that, and we manufacture sympathy for the movement. And that idea of manufacturing sympathy takes on a lot of different dimensions, some of which we're going to look at today. So that's our kind of conceptual recap of what we need to start thinking about, how we structurally integrate punches and kicks together. They're both based on the same principles, the same structural principles that we've been learning all along, and that helps them fit together like Lego bricks. There's some things we need to think about. One of them I think that's very important is that very often when you come to do live training, it won't be exactly like this, and the rules are broken all the time. It's very much how much your intent is linked into the movements, but even so many chaotic things happen and so many odd angles that your body's got to make a lot of different calculations, so you don't always do it exactly in the way that you're training in the drills, and that's completely natural. That's a lot of talking, isn't it? So let's think about, let's get into it and then explain it as we go along, some of the things that we mean. So let's start with the idea of a jab like this. And what we can see straight away is if we use the pivot route, usually we do it like that, but if we're going to do a combination with a kick, we start introducing a different kind of timing that's involved. So instead of going 1 and pulling back and then, let's say, low round kick like that, lead round kick, 1, 2. We use something that's very closely related to the idea of hit and flow. So remember we talked about we can hit and then flow into the next 1, 2, into the next punch like that, and we use that we use it in tons of different things. And this is a very similar sort of thing where we want to, at the hit point, we don't want to completely stop the posture, we want to flow into a 1, 2, into the next posture from the hit point. And this is a version of what we call compound timing. So we've looked at some ideas around that and around somatic flow, and these are all very closely related ideas. So compound timing means that the timing of the movement begins to merge together into a single movement. So instead of like 1, 2, like you might do in kickboxing, or 1 and then 2, like you might do with, for example, chain Farley, you might go 1, 2, like that, and break it into 2 movements. Instead we compound the movement, so as this hits the hit point, or if we're just doing it on the air, the lock point, so it just hits the lock point, and then we go straight into from here into the kick using what we call compound timing, so the 2 movements become 1. And one of the ways that works is that there's so much structural sympathy for the round kick from this posture, because the foot is turning over like that, so it's already round like that, and we just need to lift it and then just a little bit, with the fishtail routine that comes in like that, and just release force around the axis like that. However, things aren't quite that simple, and there's another really important principle that we need to understand, and that's that when we start to do things with power, that it changes a lot of the dynamics. And this is one of the real problems in Yiquan, where you've got people practicing stuff quite slowly all the time or quite relaxed, and it doesn't take into account the reality that when you start doing things with power, lots of things change in terms of the fundamentals of the movement. Until you start doing things with power, then you can't understand this, and you can't understand that actually you very often need to make compromises. So we've talked before about the idea of using somatic timing and how that makes compromises in terms of power, that you can't just do 1, 2, you have to do it as chain Fa Li if you do it like that to get full power out of every movement. If you want to break it down into 1, 2, then you significantly reduce the amount of power that's in each posture, but you gain speed. And these are compromises that we have to decide whether or not we want to make. This is like an absolutely fantastic example of this. It's not quite, it's a kind of somatic timing, but because of the disconnect between the arm and the leg, it's this kind of somatic timing that's happening across the whole body. And again, this speaks to the significantly complex nature of the idea of whole body connectivity, that it's so much more advanced than the idea of like in Xing Yiquan, you just all your whole body weight is behind a punch or something like that. That now you've got to think about, see how the posture 1, 2, the somatic flow through the posture like that, 1, 2, how that's an inevitable kind of use of the movement, and you can't possibly just do it like, all together like that. 1, you'd have to go 1 back, 2 back like that. And if we do that, then we lose our compound timing. But if we do it with power, so it's very easy to do it like that with no power, and practice like that, 1, 2. As soon as we start to bring power into this movement, then we start to lose the penetration with the punch. We start to lose the power of the punch, because if we want to go into the kick like that, look at the slow movement. 1, 2, 1, and then the leg goes like that. Upper body goes, and then the hips have got to go even more. So if the upper body turns round, opening, we're on the pivot route, but then for the kick, we lift and then it fishtails off the back foot, so the route changes from the front to the back foot. 1, 2 like that, and that makes our body go 1 and then 2. And those are 2 disconnected movements. And you can't just do that with power in the punch. It's not physically possible to do 1 full power, 1, and then straight into the kick with power. And this is just for the very simple reason that to get power in the punch, you've got to really hit in 1, you've got to hit in, and then you've got to change into the punch. And when you do it slowly, you don't really see that. It seems like you could use compound timing to do that. Like you could just go, and you can do it indeed like with a weak punch into the kick, but the punch has got to commit to get power. So it's got to commit, it's got to have the hit point, and there's got to be penetration from the hit point into the penetration from the hit point for there to be power, and then into the kick. And just by definition, that point there just takes a little bit of time before you can then change into the kick. So there's a limit to how fast you can get that as a compound movement. So the really good learning important takeaway is that sometimes when you do things slower, you can get like an artificially higher level of whole body interconnectivity that's gone when you add power, because power means compromise. So just like I suppose it does in terms of politics, power means compromise. 1, that's got to hit and stop, and that's got to flow on as soon as possible, so there's a limit. So there's the double dog front paw to the nuts kick. let's try a few and see what it looks like from head on. So 1, see there's a limit to how fast you can get the two combined together from this. And that all comes from hitting in with power, with the feeling up to the lock point with the jab before you can trigger the kick, and that little bit of penetration point here is that little bit of gap between the two movements. And you can compare that, for example, if you just do like just a flick like that, you can get that no problem, that speed. It's nothing to do with that. Or if you do a punch with no power whatsoever, you can get that. You know, that's a legitimate technique, the hand flick out. Somehow as fast as I can get it. I can feel in myself I'm compromising punch power to get the kick, and you can't just. But then of course, like, everything kind of has its exceptions. So the idea, I suppose, is like if you want to turn this way, you're already turning this way with a punch. So you want to turn with the kick as well. If you could just keep going on the same flow like that. 1, 2. That's the idea, like what you want to do. Then you could get this somatic flow. There is a way of doing it, and that's a foreshort on the kick. So one of the issues is we want to kick, and then we want to. You can see that the kick is quite far out, like that. If we foreshort on the kick to use this kind of posture that we have from the natural set, where we just lift almost like a knee, like that kicks in. Like that, and you foreshorten the posture, then you can get more of this somatic timing, because you've taken something else out of the equation, or somatic flow, I should say. This kind of compound movement, 1, 2, like, because you can do it with a knee much faster, because the posture's longer, so it's slower. It's going to take further to get to the contact point, so you can slow down the time. It doesn't really slow down. It doesn't really compound the movement so much as just get the hit point to the target faster, so it creates more of that impression. But you can definitely do this where you 1 and then just lift in 1, 2 like that. And what that does, you can see it hardly fishtails at all compared to that. So just uses this very small like that. So the other thing that you've then sacrificed is power. I mean, it depends how much you can generate, but around the axis, like that, you can kick in that way and get the speed on it like that, but then you sacrifice power because you've not got this bigger movement round the rotational far leg. And what you do to compensate for that, of course, is you switch to the knee. You change another parameter within the problem. So instead of this way, I'm thinking like, you know, I'm going to kick in low with the thigh, like that, into their thigh, which might be, you know, it could be a legitimate technique, of course. It doesn't have to do a lot of damage, it can just knock their leg right out, so it's a perfectly legitimate technique. But if you wanted to increase power, then you use the principle of like, what's the hit point? So you can change to the knee rather than here. So there's less movement in it. You've got the point of the knee can hit into the thigh or something like that. And because there's less going on in terms of how this bit of the limb is related to the movement like that, just exactly the same as we would do with a knee strike. Normally, we can get much more power in it and use the solidity of the target so like that. You see the oppositional force and the fishtailing of the root. So we can contract the movement into more of a compound movement by reducing the length of the movement. We lose some power if we try and maintain it as a round kick, lose some power, but we can bring that back in if we just take that out of the equation and instead switch it to a knee. The power comes right back. And so exercise number 1 is to work through all of these things. 1, 2, slow, 1, 2, and try and get that up onto the pivot root, 1, 2, and then flow, and then build up speed into the 1-2 with the longer 1-2 longer round kick, and then try changing it into a foreshortened kick like this into the thigh or something like that, and then 1-2 changing it into the knee, and you'll feel yourself. It's very much as, or it feels very much like that phenomenon where you sit on a chair and spin round and you put your legs out and you go slower, and you pull your legs in and you go faster. Once you change it into a knee, the whole thing can go faster. The fishtail route can work a little bit better, just like in a knee. So work on those three things from the jab, further out round kick, further in round kick, and then jab into knee like that, hitting up knee. You should then hopefully be able to feel all of those key differences yourself. Now let's change and let's think about, we've gone for the jab, but now we want to go for the front kick. And I think one of the first things to say about that is we shouldn't always be practicing kicks online, just as we looked at practicing punches offline a while back. Similarly, sometimes we should be practicing kicks offline, and that should be a really important part of our training, because people move. So it's something you see all the time, that people just practice everything going forward and they don't think about, it's what we call tracking a target, that people move, and we've got to track. And this is what you see when you see each one, like people like this, they move. The tracking, it's what we call tracking the target. You've got to think about incorporating tracking into your movement. But let's say we want to do we want to do the front kick straight forward, and there's slightly less structural sympathy, but we don't need, in this case anyway, we don't need to overthink this. One, it just lifts and changes and pushes in. One, changes and pushes in. And also something very important to kind of get from this is that, like, normally when we use a kick, we have this kind of explosive movement like that. It becomes a little bit more difficult when we do it with this combined into a punch, but we still try and get that. It's more difficult because, let's say I'm going to just do a kick off the front leg and I use the explosive movement off. My foot's already flat off the floor, so I can do that. But if I'm already here in a pivot route, there isn't that much to get that kind of explosive movement from the foot. But we do try still, when you're doing your drills, try and make them explosive like that, get every little tiny little bit of power. So the foot's offline, structural sympathy is less, but as we lift, 1, 2, we kick like that. And one of the benefits to this can be that people can very often, if you don't have to be great, you don't have to be a great fighter or anything like that. You just have to be really, really used to people and the way they move and the way they kick. So, and your intent will just take in all of that information. So people start seeing things like when your foot turns like that over, and then you very often think you're going to go for a side kick or something like that, or the leg comes up like that, and you think it's probably going to be a front kick, unless they're going to change it deliberately to fool you. It's coming in like this. It's coming in like this. It might change to a front kick, but in most cases it's not. It's coming in like this. It's probably going to be a round kick. And of course you can manipulate that, and people do by like changing to a different kick and faking people. So it's kind of a natural fake because the foot's going off to the side. Not everyone will get on that, and some people will. Did you enjoy your tea? Yes, good. The licking of the lips is the seal of approval. Right, you stand out of the way, treasure. Come on, Treasure. Right. Using your whole body structure. Ha ha! Ha ha! Tricked you. No, mate. But other than that, it's not that much difficult to then move into the front kick. We just lift it, and the change back into alignment just happens in the movement. We just circle it up and change into the front kick like that. Out. Go on. Go on. Out. can't believe he actually obeyed me. So, 1, he's still there looking at the door. 1, 2, and then everything else, like for the first kind of kick, is the same. 1, 2. Very often, like to compound the movement more, we may very well foreshorten the pivot route. That's something that happens all the time in sparring. Just really do it much more small than you would if you were going to do the full punch. It loses a bit of power, but a little bit of structure. But so you can see you probably can't even see it, but I assure you it's lifting up into the punch, but it's a foreshortened pivot into the posture. So see, it just changes. By definition, it's here, so it's got to change and then go like that. 1, 2, 3, and that can be quite confusing in itself for the person looking at it. And also, a lot changes when you start moving as well. When you're moving in sparring, and you might be just faking that you're going to go for the kick. And very often when you're moving, you don't always want to be on the pivot route as such, so you might sometimes throw the jab without the pivot route and then go for the kick. All of these variations happen. So again, a couple of times like this, and you can see the distance in there. It's the same thing if I go for a flip, I can get the movement faster. Gives the illusion of more somatic flow. I can feel in myself it's not the same. It's not the same as, that's got a lot of somatic flow, but you can only kind of do that relaxed like that. As soon as you change into the lock point, you need that penetration point with a punch, so you lose that. You have a bit of a gap instead. And from there, we can think, well, what about the other 2 things that we did with the round kick, the knee and the foreshortened round kick? We don't really have this foreshortened round kick like that. You could do something up into the crotch, 1, 2, like that. It's not that powerful. Doesn't have to be, of course, if it connects. 1, 2, we don't really have that as such, but we can do the knee. We can do the knee like that. We've not really looked at knees as such yet, but we just use a very, very sharp use of the fishtail routing, and we try and get like an arc between so just like with the kicks, when you fall forward a little bit, one of the reasons you do that is you're arcing the root back into the floor, relying on the contact point. We very much do that with the knee. So we don't want a knee and then the energy's pushing back all the way like that. We want the energy to be pushing back down into the floor, so we lean forward with the posture. So we do exactly the same like that. You can see the way the posture sets with the fishtail root like that into the knee. So we can do it like that, no problem. You give me the evil eye. So again, your exercises for that are just to practice 1, 2, 1. Practice foreshortening the pivot a little bit. You've got to play with the movements, and you've got to feel it yourself, like changing the emphasis on which part of the movement. And this is more advanced kind of structural movement knowledge that you can only do this if you kind of developing your overall whole body integrated feeling. So you can play with where the emphasis is on each movement and think about, well, if I put more power in the punch, what happens? If I put less power in the punch, what happens? More power in the kick. And thinking about how you do that and playing with that. So same as if you're doing it on a bag as if you're doing it on air. And you can play with the different ways of emphasizing the power points in the configuration, or the distribution of power within a compound configuration. So like, where is the power? How is it distributed through the different elements of the combination? So you can play with that yourself. So now let's think about, so same for jab, same for hook. Uppercut, the pivot root tends to be a little bit flatter rather than rounder, as we looked at before, because with the uppercut we push back up we push back up like that. And that means it's got more structural sympathy with the front kick because it's already facing that way. And also the side kick because it can just come straight up like that into the... But also, if it's on the side like that, that also has a lot of structural sympathy with the side kick, so it doesn't really matter that much. But it definitely has more structural sympathy with the front kick. So 1, 2, like that. But where it has less structural sympathy is you're leaning back on the posture. So you lose this kind of where we lean in a little bit with the. I mean, I should say with that, you don't always do that. It's like we begin from the point of maximum power generation, and then we think about other. Like sometimes you want to lean back because something's swinging in, or with round kicks you want to do them be able to do them at different angles with the head moving. But we haven't really looked at that kind of stuff now. We just start from the point of what's the maximum power generation of the most fundamental principles of the reality of the context of the fight, and that's what we've done so far. So 1, it's already leaning back a lot like that. So 1, now we've got a lift as well, lift. So we just kind of lose this kind of closed and open posture with the front kick like that, just goes a little bit. That we want like a little ball that scrunches up and then expands like a nuclear explosion. We're already here, so it's just, I mean, that aids lifting the leg up as well, but in a weird way you can feel that you just lose you want to come back into this and then open like that. You've just got to be a little bit wary of that because you lose speed with that. So you sacrifice power, you lose this explosive movement, or you lose a part of that explosive power. So, and a lot more just goes on in the opening of the leg and the pushing forwards with the quad and the turn around. You lose some of this power around the explosive movement of the rotational thigh lead around the axis. As ever, most of this you just learn. You learn it somatically, like it's just useful to have it explained in detail, I think, like understand the science of it, the science of each one. So 1, and then out. Push out with we've looked at how to do kicks on it, so I don't really need to like that. So 1, lifts up, it's going quite far back, and then kick out like that. You can see the drop forward because we want that angle on the leg, rather than if you kick back like that, then you thrust yourself back. We want to lock it into the floor on that angle. 1, 2. Same for 1. If we want to do side kick, it's very similar because it's not straight. It's not dead straight like that. It's in between, so it's kind of got half structural sympathy for the front kick and half for the side kick like that. What makes it difficult for the round kick is precisely this idea that you're leaning back with the uppercut. 1. So you've already opened a quad quite a lot, which doesn't leave that much for the side kick, for the round kick. Doesn't leave that much zing. There's not enough stored force in the posture. So again, you can start seeing how these ideas interlink. Like we've talked about the idea of stored force. 1, 2. There's not enough stored force really to get enough power, or as much power as we want. And this is why also those people who talk about, this kind of so-called Hanshi Yiquan thing, where they just talk about doing standing and then some kind of force, elemental force, floods your body and you don't actually need any structure or anything like that. It's just like electricity, you can just touch someone and they'll fly away. So why it's nonsense, because when you hear things like this, these are real principles of physics and real principles of science. What did Wang Shanzhai say? If it's not in harmony with the principles of science, and if it contradicts the principles of science, then it's not each one. So 1 from here, And we've got to use a little bit more of pulling back the leg like that. It's very much like short power, where we have to get the rotation of the arm in to create more movement, to get more power, to make the movement bigger. We can do the same thing by pulling the leg back like that, like a circle like that, just to get more power on it. I saw someone talking about, someone saying that the Yiquan round kick is just this movement from the, it's a movement from the natural set, from the Shaolin natural set. It's just one of the body's natural movements. So you can say, yeah, okay, that is Yiquan. That's the core Yiquan. But there's absolutely no reason why you can't modify those postures, and that's what every branch of Yiquan does. That's the whole point. That's like the clay that you then mould into the different cultural sets of Yiquan. You know, the cultural set based on like Western boxing or kickboxing, the cultural set based more on Xing Yiquan, the cultural set based more on Bagua. And there's really no limit to that, to how you can do that. So yes, you can see now, like, once we start understanding that idea of cultural sets and the science of Yiquan, then when you go into the infinite curriculum, and within the infinite curriculum there's these different cultural sets, and these are also infinite. So it's about problem solving. How do I generate power? It's the same problem that Wang Xiangjia begins us with this concept of Taolu. My target is here, and I want to hit it, and I want to hit it with the back of my hand. So how do I do that? What's my configuration? And understanding how the configurations work. You know, I can do it like that, or I can do it like that, and why would I do it this way and not do it that way? Understanding configurations. In exactly the same way, the problem solving, I'm here, and I want to hit this leg with this part of my body. What's the best way to do it? And the best way to do it isn't to go like that from there, which would be the movement from the Shaolin natural set, like that, closing like that, closing the hips like that, or opening like that. Doesn't matter which way you do it. All those movements in the Shaolin natural set can be done open, close. Open, close, up or down. Somewhere they can usually be done 1, 2 or 3 different ways. Doesn't really matter which way you do it. There's no power in it if you do it that way. It's a little bit different. That way you can just get a tiny little bit more power, but it's still not that powerful, to be honest. But from here, it's not even it. It's just, the structure is wrong. The structure is wrong for that posture. So that's not the solution. So this is how you scientifically think about problem solving with configurations. I hope people can see this is like, it's a scientific method of Yiquan that's just it's on an entirely different level, and this is what should be happening every generation. It should be improving like this, and people's understanding should be building on what went before to elevate it to this kind of conceptual understanding. So instead, the solution to the problem is to lift and just circle a little bit with and then put the zing on with the Farley. That's the solution to the problem. There might be another solution, but that's the solution that, for me, most naturally presents itself. That's how that configuration should be structured. So 1, 2, 1, circles a little bit, circles round to get more force on it, more circling force, and then kicks in this way. Like that. 1. So now let's think 1, and we want to do side kick. Well, it's just a very similar thing. The side kick uses that technique anyway. So that technique of moving around like that, or using the rotation of the shoulder in short power, the side kick always uses that, like this kind of posture like that. It always uses that movement, one way or another. Even if it's just up and down like that, it's still coming up and down like that. And usually you don't want it like 1, 2 like that. You want it 1, 2, this round movement like that. So the side kick configurationally always solves the problem of power generation in that way. So this just naturally flows along with the 1, 2 into the, like that. And you kick in and the whole body opens like that, the whole quad opens into a straight line. So, like that. Whole body opens like that. So we know we've got other kicks, and we've also got hitting down postures like that. Hitting down postures are very similar, just that the legs are a little bit more bent, and actually that can add a little bit more force onto the kick, because you've just got more, this idea of contracting and then expanding. We talked about the idea of structural expansion, structural contraction. They're two of the same things really. Like one's open and one's closed. It's the same way of issuing postures. One's doing the opposite of the other in terms of the body. When we go, let's say we do this, this idea, wushu is open, close, up and down. We're going up, that's open, that's closed. Even though the chest is very much opening, nevertheless the hips are going together like that, so that's closed, and then that's down. So all our basic punches cover this wushu principle of open, close, up and down. Open, close, up, down, and the same for open, close with the hooks. So with down, what this does is it stores more force in the legs. So we drop, and then you can spring up a little bit like that. Stores more force in the legs, you can get a little bit more power on the kick because of that, but it also slows the posture down. So it's just more weight going down, and then it's got to come back up there. But what we can then do is use our somatic timing. This is the kind of somatic timing that's usually most obvious in each one, where people go and they bounce like that. They're going to bounce into the, usually you only see it practice like, and you think, well, why do that? And it's like, so bounce into the next posture. So it's a very important form of somatic timing that particularly uses the legs in relation to the whole body. So one, and then bounce up into the next posture. So boing, 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 use the muscle bounce like that. This is planting fist, of course, where you hit over someone's guard, catch the jaw, or maybe just punch into the side of the neck, or sometimes into the chest. So for front kick, for example, we'll just try and use that bounce up into the, and then everything else is exactly the same. It's exactly the same consideration for all the other kicks. For all the other kicks, we just use this bounce into. So your training drills for that will just be like slow first, and just try to get that feeling of the bounce with it. Remember, the pivot root usually comes up a lot higher with and the leg turns in a lot more when we drop the weight like that. But what we don't want to do is go 1, 2. This is the posture where we actually can start bringing together that compound movement a little bit more, because we can use the somatic bounce a little bit more effectively. So 1, 2, really try and get that into the posture like that. It's just like, I would say it's like the least useful punch. It's not, it's a really, really useful punch when it's got its moments, but it's just like not the one we use all the time, like jab or something like that. It's quite close range, it's quite risky, but we can use it very much like this with a somatic timing from the bounce, and use that to create a more compound movement. And that also begins to teach you a higher level of understanding of the differences of compound movement and the different degrees and ways of thinking and practicing them. Okay, now let's start thinking about back leg kicks and backhand punches. So we'll start obviously with the cross. Why? Obviously, that's just it's funny how brains work. Like for me, punches go in the order jab, hook, uppercut, planting fist. Kicks go in the order front kick, round kick, side kick. Whereas my senior student is always like, no, the order is round kick, side kick, front kick. You know, there's a different order that seems completely natural to him. So it's quite an interesting, the way the mind functions with the information. So 1 onto the pivot root. We can see straight away that what's going to happen here is we can get more somatic flow. It's just much more structurally sympathetic. So it's going to go 1, 2 like that into the kick, and this is where you start seeing really nice, really flowing combinations of people who've got really good structural flow. Do their combinations like this that other people find quite hard. They still work in terms of chains, like 1, 2, 3, and it's like, well, how do you get that really nice structural flow? Really good example is Valentina Shevchenko, who's a fantastic fighter. You watch her training and her structural flow is just like, you know, it's absolutely top draw. So 1, it's already on the pivot root, and all we've got to do is push a little bit forward into it. We don't want to waste too much time on that. We want to, it's already there, rooting the posture. It's already pushing. So we just want to push, go with the push, lift the knee through, high as ever. That's another critical mistake. Don't push through and then lift like that. Remember, we talked about, really in all of Chinese Wushu, most of these kicks, I mean, not this kick from the natural set, kind of come straight up from the floor, these kind of kicks, but these front kick, round kick, side kick, they lift up into the, so you can see here, you don't want to come up like that, and then you've got to get to the target. What you're going to do, come back in again like that. And some people do that, 1, 2, 3, like that. You sometimes see that. And you can sometimes do that deliberately just to throw people off with the timing. But usually we want 1, come straight up like that, and then out. 1, 2. And you've got to time it sort of 1, it's all one flow, keeps flowing forward, but in the middle of the flow, it changes into the release force around the axis like that. And you may find that as you go for the kick, the front foot may come back a little bit like that. It's just pulling the root under your body weight a little bit more. I've talked before about how your E just learns to do that, just learns to do these little things. And it does it also in terms of distance and where the target is. So if the target is closer, changing the distance of the target like that. It's more advanced use of footwork, so you don't have to worry about that too much. But if you find yourself doing it, just check, 1, that it's not too much overextending you. If it's just a little bit, it's just your intent is just balancing the posture, and also can add a little bit of force into this because of the explosiveness of the movement. So just pulling it under your weight better. But what I mean by that is it isn't necessarily pulling it under your direct axis or in line with your central axis, because it comes back to, it's determined by the rule that you want this leg on an angle when you kick into the target if possible. So the force goes down into the ground, not back like that if your leg is straight. It's determined by that, so that's what your intent is doing. It's creating this arced structure. And you can play with it by visualising targets that are nearer or further. Like I visualised the target further away there. You'll find that your E has a default. So that, see, my foot is just moving back a little bit. Or you can play with it, you can visualise someone's further away and do a bigger movement. Or you can visualise that they're closer. And these are all things that we haven't looked at these postures yet, but they're all special kinds of steps that we use to create distancing in kicks, like moving the leg back like that. And knee strikes also use this kind of, particularly for knees, because we want to create this angle with the rooting into the floor, but we'll look at that another time. Now, of course, what changes is the back foot doesn't really do that much different. It does a little bit, you know, there's a slight difference between a cross and a hook. You can see my foot is just following my intention like that. Try not to think about it, and it just does it naturally. The target's there, it's in line. If it changes like that, it's just adjusting itself to the, you see that? It's partly I'm turning my body, you know, but it's partly my intent is doing it, just putting everything in line. It's a slight difference, but it doesn't make that much difference to the, so if we one, two like that, it's slightly more structurally sympathetic to go hook, round kick like that, and we can kind of start like that, just because it's just pulling it around slightly more to be in line with the target. We can get a nice flow on it. Get a nice good structural flow, start compounding the movement really nicely with that. The danger of that is that our intent will always follow, it's like water flowing down a mountain. It's going to try and follow the path of least resistance. It's kind of how intent works, and we're trying to work with that principle to give it like the roots to flow down, so that it knows it can just do that in the moment. But that means that sometimes, like if we want to do something else, that it jars a little bit against what the intent wants to do. So we've got to practice like 1, 2, changing, doing things that have less structural sympathy. We've also got to practice that until that also becomes routine, until the intent also becomes completely familiar with manufacturing sympathy. It's why we have this key concept. You can't just rely on, well, that's sympathetic, so I always go with that. That's the mistake Yiquan made. Like, that's sympathetic with the alignment of the body. That isn't, you know? So even though that's in Yiquan, there's a very limited amount of postures where it's not in direct alignment, like 90% are in direct alignment, because that's the path of least resistance for the intent to take all the time to generate power. We've got to break out of that paradigm. We've got to think about things that aren't structurally sympathetic in the same way, you know, that challenge the intent, the E, in a different way. And we do that through drills. We train it like a dog. We just keep training it and training it and training it. It's like people elevating E to some kind of godlike force. Was a mind force, spiritual mind force. No, it's like a dog. It's like a dog that you've got to train to do your bidding. So, 1, the sympathy is less for the front kick, but nevertheless, it's just got to come through and straighten up into the kick like that. And you can hardly feel it anyway, but what you're doing is manufacturing sympathy. And even though you can hardly feel it in the movement itself, nevertheless, your E will, if you don't practice like that, your E will always go like 1, 2, that's got the most sympathy, it'll always want to do that, and then you'll keep doing it, and then people will clock that. So you've got to train it out of it. Just feels slightly more awkward for your body, but only slightly. But that slightness is enough for your intent to significantly favour doing it just with a round kick. Hook kick, round kick. I've done it myself. In fact, I was talking about it. I did it this year, where I was just doing so many things where, without even thinking about it, I was always doing side kick with an uppercut, side kick, and then one day I thought, oh God, I keep doing uppercuts with side kicks. So I started changing, like, I'm going to do hook, side kick, and I still kept doing uppercuts, and I still kept going for round kicks with the hook and things like that, because it discombobulated my intent, and I realised, oh, that was a really stupid thing to do, to drill that in. You know, I drilled it in over one summer, and that was this year, so it doesn't matter what level you're at, you know, it takes almost nothing to drill stuff in like that, so you've got to be really, really careful about it. Really think about how you're designing your training and your drills to work on everything, and think very deliberately about movements that are structurally sympathetic, movements that have far less structural sympathy, and making sure that you're drilling both, so your intent learns how to manufacture sympathy and be comfortable with it. So having said that, let's go hook, hook, very structurally sympathetic, for the side kick, we're doing back leg out. Hook, same thing, 1. This has got a different kind of structural sympathy in that it can come through like this, 1 and then, and this is that kind of rounded movement that we looked at before. Normally with the front one, it's just in and out like that. And then for the back one, it's going to come across. Just doesn't normally. It would normally come like straight up into the chest like that. Straight up into the chest. This is how you practice them, by the way. You practice for them like this, 1, 2, and then 1, 2, out like that. But here we can use a different kind of structural sympathy, still using that circular movement to generate extra force, but it goes on an angle. So 1, 2. The only thing you've got to watch is not catching your leg with your foot. So 1, and that's all about bringing the leg through flat like that. And it's one of the reasons why in traditional wushu you'll very often see this foot pointing down posture, and people think it's just for flash, you know, like just for the aesthetic. No, it's got a really, really important function in training the intent to be able to do that in particular moments. So 1 and into the 1, 2, 3, like that. And again, my foot's still like it's adding this extra little step back into it like that, and that does add more force into the posture. It creates the explosive movement of the legs moving apart like that. It's one of the more advanced features of Yiquan kicking technique, and that also helps create more power out of a smaller movement, or what seems like a smaller movement, because small movement isn't just about small movement. It can be about the space that the movement occurs in, particularly for the onlookers who are watching it. So if you've got like a small space like this, and you change like that, very often people can't quite grasp straight away that you move the other leg back like that, and in doing that you created more space for the posture. You created much more movement, but you didn't use any more space, so it creates that kind of optical illusion that well, how did you get that power from such a small movement? Actually, it was bigger than it looked. So like I say, don't worry if you start finding your leg do that. It's an advanced skill. So you don't have to do it. Don't have to do it. Sometimes practice deliberately not doing it, but for the most part, you actually want that. So just moves back a little bit, even as it fishtails like that. Fishtails, and remember that's what we call a sliding set, where it moves like that. And you kick kind of, in this case it still kicks on the set, but it slides into the set like that. So again, one more time. So now you also see the importance of hit and stop on a, well, we should have seen it anyway in all the other combinations we've done, but 1, 2 straight into the, we don't want to go 1, 2 like that, we just want to go straight into the principle of continuous attack, the real principle of continuous attack. 1, 2, like that. Next, if we go for the uppercut like this, the foot is turned in, so like in theory it's got structural sympathy for kicking out because it's already pointing that way, but in reality, usually if we're thinking about our opponent is directly in front of us, their leg is here, but this leg is pointing that way, so it'd have to come out like that to kick. The structural sympathy for this, really, even though the leg's turned that way, is just to come through like that. That's the full sympathy. 1, 2, if someone was there, you could go for the front kick like that. So for here, again, it's a similar problem that we had before with the front kick about how we generate power, because this is going to be quite an odd movement like that. This is much more, there's a little bit of this same solution with the circularity of the lower limb, but not as much by any means. This is very much about require. This is very much about your cultivation and your ability to issue force from your core axis. So 1, it's about how you can throw the leg around the imaginary axis running through the body and how you can do that with the, doesn't use so much. Remember I talked about the use of outliers. The shoulders are already around here. They're already quite far around, so I haven't got much to play with the shoulders. Otherwise I'll be turning my body around like that. You can see how that idea works. And it's throwing my leg out a bit. So that's what we would say. There's not enough stored force in the shoulder, but also there is stored force. But if I use it, it will contradict the context of the reality of the fight by moving me around. However, look at my hips, they're flat. So these have got far more stored force in them because they can go round without turning me all the way around the other way like that. So again, we start seeing the intellectual integration of the system and understanding these concepts like stored force. Now we see, like, once it's scientifically and properly explained and understood, everything just falls into place. This is why I'm saying this is the real thing. It's obviously the real thing. It's not a coincidence that all of this works, functions, links directly to the old wushu manuals, explains all of them. They explain all of this. They're talking about this, you know, not some nonsense that somebody's just kind of made up randomly. Or even learn from their teacher. I couldn't care less. I couldn't care less who their teacher was. So this is flat, and this is stored force, and you can, like that. So it doesn't use so much the circular like we did with the front kick, but it does use the articulation of the knee joint to get round. One from doing uppercut like that. But the power is really going to come from what we can do with the stored force in our hips, like that. And that's going to require very much a compound Farley movement. You could see that you've got to lift up off the floor with an explosive movement. Once you get your weight off and up into the air, then the hip, the quad explosive movement takes over. You want to get all that weight off the floor so that it can move faster and generate force. And yes, you should lift up, and yes, you should jump, and yes, you should leave the floor. So some of the stuff that's talked about in Yiquan power comes from the floor, is generated from the floor. And no, what? No, how does the floor generate power? Structure is linked to the floor in multiple different ways. Power isn't generated in the legs and spiraled up into the body. We've talked about this idea and how that functions. Why that idea is wrong before. And this is a great example. One, you want to lift all the weight up, and the power is all coming from here. Apart from the explosive movement from the leg, that's lifting our weight, just bluntly lifting our weight up explosively off the floor. All the power is coming from our rotational Farley around this axis, central axis. The more we lift off the floor, the better it is up to a certain point. And if we go too far off the floor, then we're too far away from the target. But you know, if you're athletic enough, you can go for a head kick or something like that. Lots of people do. So we don't want to lift too far past the target. But one, we want to jump up explosively and then change into the kick like that. You can even see in the movement, even if I just do it like that, kind of relaxed, you can see that's right. That's the correct movement. So hook we've done, hook 1, 2, yeah, we've done that. Uppercut and then into the round kick, and that begins to, like, that's most of the basic stuff that we need. And what changes then is just like the next escalation of these basics is to think about 2 punch combinations and how they flow together. So 1, 2, 3. You can clearly hear the set in the 1, 2, 3 like that. That just signifies that little move back of the kick like that to get the power in it like that. It's a really important technique. But actually, for that 1, 2, if you practice cross front kick like that, that's exactly the same posture as jab cross front kick like that. All you've done is add a jab onto the front of it. You just bolt it on like a Lego brick. I mean, you're using your structural sympathy and your complementary routing. 1, 2, 3 into the posture 1, 2, 3. And you start getting really smooth, fast, really ace combinations like, this kind of thing. And you just piece them on like that, and you just put the kick on the end. That's the next escalation. Of course, the escalation after that is to think about kick first and then into the punch. But we'll look at that another time. I think that's enough to look at for today in terms of beginning to think about how you integrate punches with kicks, and there's plenty to practice there. Again, you've got to be critically engaged. You've got to think about the drills that you're going to build around that. You've got to take ownership of your training. 90% of it, even if you've got like the greatest teacher in the world living with you, 95% of it is you just doing the basic work, just doing the basic run work. That's it. Hope that was useful. One love. Take it easy. I'll see you in the next one.